Catalyst Conversations. I'm happy to welcome you to a Catalyst Conversation. Catalyst Conversations was founded in 2012 to open a critical path for dialogue between the arts and sciences. We present intimate and provocative conversations between artists, scientists, and the public. We are interested in connecting the two through programs, educational outreach, and public events like this, which demonstrate the important conversation and synergy between art, science, and technology. This evening, our three speakers will address these big questions. How does the Galápagos continue to entice us as it has for a century and a half? And what are the effects of climate change on evolution? They all investigate these and other issues in their respective practices and will do so in the ensuing discussion. Our participants this evening are Allison Maria Rodriguez, Noah Charney, and Andrew Berry. As Eduardo said, we welcome your questions and comments. You can use the Q&A button, and Eduardo will read them to our speakers after the conversation. I'm going to introduce everyone in the order they will present, which they'll do first, each of them, and then be in conversation with each other. Allison Maria Rodriguez is a first-generation Cuban-American interdisciplinary artist working predominantly in video installation. She creates immersive experiential spaces that challenge conventional ways of knowing and understanding the world. Her work focuses extensively on climate change, species extinction, and the interconnectivity of existence. Through video, performance, digital animation, photography, drawing, collage, and installation, Rodriguez merges and blends mediums to create new pictorial spaces for aesthetic, emotional, and conceptual exploration. She uses art to communicate beyond language, to open up a space of possibility for the viewer to encounter alternative ways of connecting to the emotional realities of others. In her work, Wish You Were Here, Rodriguez navigates the unsteady terrain between conservation and consumption, environmental advocacy and tourism, and sustainability and exploitation. Noah Charney is Assistant Professor of Conservation Biology at the University of Maine. In research, writing, and teaching, work in the Charney Lab spans landscape ecology, conservation biology, natural history, public policy, and environmental education. Protecting the Galápagos Islands, sometimes referred to as an evolutionary showcase and a living museum, is a priority for Charney. The Galápagos are a global treasure, about the 19-island volcanic archipelago that's home to giant tortoises, finches, marine iguanas, flightless cormorants, huge cacti, land snails, mockingbirds, corals, sharks, penguins, sea lions, iguanas, and seabirds. With an undergraduate degree in zoology from Oxford and a PhD in evolutionary genetics from Princeton, Andrew Berry originally came to Cambridge, Mass. As a Harvard Junior Fellow. He is currently an assistant head tutor of integrative biology and lecturer on organismic and evolutionary biology at Harvard. Berry says that for me, a biologist interested in evolution on islands, the Galápagos are iconic. The islands have played central roles both in the history of scientific thinking and in our ongoing efforts to understand how biological diversity comes about. But these roles are richer and more complex than might first appear. Darwin had no eureka moment there. In fact, he was positively confused by what he saw. And those famous finch species, each with its distinctive bill, their evolution has in fact been a much messier process than a textbook suggests. Scientific discovery and the natural world itself refuse to be turned into cliches. So with that, Allison will be our first presenter, and here she is.
Okay, so first of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm on the sacred land of the Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples. I'm so grateful to be here today, sharing space with all of you. Thank you so much to Deborah for creating such an incredible series like this and for inviting me. And thank you to Molly and Eduardo, all the folks at Catalyst Conversations. Many thanks to my fellow speakers, who I'm so honored to speak alongside, and to George Fifield and Boston Cyber Arts for their ongoing support of me and my work. So as mentioned, I'm a first-generation Cuban-American interdisciplinary artist that works mostly in video installation, and I tend to focus on themes of climate change, species extinction, and this concept of universal interconnection. I'll be showing you mostly stills in this presentation due to the nature of this particular platform, and I'm going to talk specifically about my work in regard to Galapagos, but then I'm going to also briefly contextualize that work in my practice as a whole. So I came to work in climate change via a very instinctual impulse. Art is essentially my way of moving through the world. And I often speak of the fact that making my work, the really selfish part of that process, is really all about my own survival and my own methods for emotionally processing the world around me. And there's definitely a distinction I want to make right here. It's one thing to intellectually process something, such as climate change or personal trauma. And it's really another thing entirely to emotionally or even spiritually process it. So my work helps me navigate the world, and I view climate change as an ongoing collective trauma. My work itself is very technical in execution, but it emerges from a place of profound intimacy. I'm always looking for uniquely intimate methods for approaching a conversation about environmentalism. My first project that dealt specifically with the Galapagos and was really a turning point for me in my practice was actually a piece I did as part of Boston Cyber Arts Art on the Marquee program back in 2015. It was called A Poem for Lonesome George. So I created this 80-foot by 24-foot 7-screen work as a memorial to George, who was the last Pinta Island tortoise that passed away in the Galapagos. George was the sole survivor of his species for over 40 years. He was considered the rarest creature on Earth, and he became a conservation icon. So my work was not only a memorial to his loss, but I saw it as a loss of a part of myself and a part of existence that had been lost as well. The way I see it, extinction is a collective loss. And this is a shot of Wish You Were Here, Greetings from the Galapagos at the Boston Children's Museum in 2018. The title plays off the conflict between consumption and conservation, between tourism and environmentalism. And I'm going to read you something I wrote in my journal while I was making this piece. Last year, I traveled to the Galapagos Islands. I felt I had stepped back to a place I recognized from my past, but had only experienced in my imagination. As a child, when the world seemed so big and boundless, I explored landscapes like this, untouched by humans. But as I stood upon the volcanic rock of this dynamic ecosystem filled with life, I felt the fleetingness of its being in every step I took. Both beautiful and foreboding, I wanted to somehow envelop it, to enclose this place in a cavity of myself where I could keep it and protect it. So in this piece, essentially, I make reference to the Earth as a conscious being that experiences climate change as trauma. The viewer is placed in the center of the piece, and the left and right screens represent the change of seasons and atmospheric phenomenon, the original habitat of now extinct species. And the middle screen is filled with still present animals that are a composite of travel photographs I took in Galapagos. Extinct animals begin to emerge on the left and right screens, and they appear chronologically as they had disappeared from the Earth. And all three screens throughout the whole time are talking to one another. Slowly, the Galapagos animals in the center transition into extinct species by changing from color imagery to pencil sketches. Then they disappear from the middle screen and appear on the left or right. So we see them visually transition into extinction, from living to memory to myth. I also utilize this abstracted brain scan imagery, animated synaptic flashes, and the interactive compartmentalization occurring on all three screens to convey the interconnectivity of human action and impact, as well as how our existence is directly linked to the existence of other species. I'm also in the video in multiple places representing myself as a conservationist and a consumer that looks at what's happening, but doesn't really necessarily see it. Being in a place like Galapagos is very complicated for me because in some ways I very much belong there, and in other ways I simply do not. If I believe in the interconnectivity of all existence, which is essentially the foundation of all of my work, then Galapagos is a part of me, and I'm a part of Galapagos. But we as a species have done so much damage to the planet that is extremely fraught, and I experience both profound beauty and profound sadness within my very physical bond to the land. Ultimately, in this piece, like in all my work, I'm more interested in creating a feeling in the viewer, in openness, than in teaching something in particular. I really think there are others that can do that far better than I can. Galapagos is like a place in a story. It accentuates the possibilities of our world, and it highlights the beauty that can be more difficult to see in other contexts, but it exists everywhere. I actually originally come from a background in literature, and magical realism functions very heavily in my practice. I use it as a device to highlight how magical reality really is. The way I see it, we're surrounded by the fantastic every day, but we don't necessarily see it. Galapagos makes us see it. Over 15 years ago, environmentalist Bill McKibben wrote an article entitled, "What the Warming World Needs Now is Art, Sweet Art," which said the following. Here's the paradox. If the scientists are right, we're living through the biggest thing that's happened since human civilization emerged. One species, ours, has by itself in the course of a couple of generations managed to powerfully raise the temperature of an entire planet, to knock its most basic systems out of kilter. But oddly, though we know about it, we don't know about it. It hasn't registered in our gut. It isn't part of our culture. Where are the books, the poems, the plays, the goddamn operas? So McKibben's quote really motivates me to think about my own skill set as an artist and to focus on what I can contribute. Art is my way of communicating with the world. And like McKibben, I really do believe that art is a skill when applied collaboratively, working in a interdisciplinary context is really going to be a part of any strategy that will save our species. It was also my experience simply being in Galapagos that largely determined the trajectory of my practice. One of my most recent bodies of work, a video installation project called All That Moves, was created and inspired by my experience at the Churchill Northern Studies Center in Manitoba, where I was invited to do an Earthwatch fellowship working on their climate change at the Arctic's Edge project. This is documentations from a few months ago at Installation Space in North Adams. I mentioned this particular body of work because it's about a profound connection I experienced to another landscape, Churchill, where because of its extremely stark beauty, it highlights the mark of humans upon the land. But Churchill, like Galapagos, makes one see the magical as real, the possibilities as endless, and is for me a very charged space of spiritual connection. So in wrapping up, my installations are intended to make you feel first and think second. I evoke the visceral power of places and experiences like Galapagos to try to create an intimate moment or an opportunity for the viewer to open themselves up to the possibility of seeing the world differently. So the possibility of feeling connected to something outside of yourself. Ultimately, I'm interested in working towards shifting our worldview. I'm interested in the possibility of breaking down our colonial relationship to the land and to other species through this feeling of interconnection and universal oneness. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Noah is next.
All right, thank you. Let me try to share my screen here. And if you hear my kids running around under my feet, that's what that noise is. Thanks, Allison. You know, that was really cool. And it reminds me of this whole thing that, you know, there's the emotional reaction to the change that like the feeling of nostalgia and stuff that I feel in seeing the loss. And then at the same time as the scientist holding these long views of sort of things that always happen, and there's a little dissonance in me as I think about this and the things I'm going to talk about. And Allison, you talk about the last of the species of the Galapagos, the giant tortoise, which reminds me that, you know, that it's maybe the last of that species, and it's also the Galapagos giant tortoise is sort of the last of the giant tortoises that used to be everywhere on all continents until people wiped them out, and until there's only 2 islands in Aldabra, Atoll, and Galapagos where we still have giant tortoises. So the Galapagos is kind of, you know, it's a little like museum back in time of a different sort of space and different place, and it's pretty neat, as you all know. It's got the sort of deserty parts of it, and it's got these parts of it that are more have more lush vegetation, moister kind of habitats, and generally this graph here shows all points across the Galapagos archipelago, and we're graphing precipitation versus temperature, and we can kind of see like there's the lowlands that are warm and dry, and the uplands that are cool and wet. Up on top of the volcanoes, that's where those tortoises were sitting in that water hole there. And generally, if you think about the average temperature and precipitation across all of the islands there, that red point right in the middle is the average of what the Galapagos temperature and precipitation is over long periods of time, or over like our current last few decades, across the whole place. Now, if we think about climate change, where is it going to be in the future? And we can project forward, and these are projections of what the average is going to look like in the future. And I'll say also, we have blue here, which is the past, looking back thousands of years, 130,000 years in the past, and then into the future, up to the end of the century. And what happens in the future depends on what we do, like how many carbon emissions we let out into the atmosphere, and the scenario that unfolds geopolitically and all that kind of stuff. It also depends on what models we use as scientists and how the physics and the mechanics of those models work, because we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. And it also, it also depends how far forward we look in time. But generally, the basic gist of this graph, I know it's just kind of a boring black and white, but the gist is that these points all fall outside of the bounds of any place on the Galapagos, the average temperature and precipitation right now. So what this is saying is that the average future isn't going to look like anywhere on the Galapagos average right now. And in some places you think about like the climate change, everything's moving up the mountain or something, and you could just sort of say it's going to be like it is down here, but up there. That's not really the case here. It's going to be different from anything we've experienced, at least when you think about averages. Although, of course, the Galapagos isn't really about averages. It's a dynamic, complex system where there's like seasonal, wet and dry seasons that change, but then there's from year to year big changes because it's driven by El Nino and La Nina, these rain events and sort of warm and cool events. They're sort of a complicated oscillation that happens in the ocean. But basically, here's a graph of what that looks like. These are big rainfall events, and then there's sort of droughty years, and then a lot of rain, and then not, and then some more. And so you have these El Nino years where there's a lot of rain. And if you put on top of that, this is the number of caterpillars in the Galapagos. So the points there are the number of caterpillars. So you can see that the things, the animals, the vegetation, everything tracks this rainfall pretty well. And then if you stack on top of that, the birds, the finches that Darwin loved to play with, they track the insects too. So you see that you have these big booms in the population sizes and abundances of finches a little bit after these El Nino years. So the system is really driven by these dynamic rain events. You get these El Nino events and you have a lot of terrestrial blooming of greenness. However, in those El Nino warm years, you actually have a whole different thing going on in the marine system. It's not as nutrient rich. And so actually there's the marine iguanas, for instance, in those warm, wet years, there's less algae for them to eat, and they actually shrink in size during those years. So not good for everybody, just the warmer, wet years. So in general, we've seen over the last few decades signs that things are changing. There's less droughts. The drought frequency is going down. This is a so it's getting wetter. And we are interested in sort of mapping and predicting kind of like what is going to happen. And you can look at the vegetation on the Galapagos using satellites. So satellites have been orbiting for decades, and we've taken an image and sort of mapped out the greenness of the landscape. How productive is any part on the landscape of the Galapagos? And we can sort of roll this forward and try to predict, based on what we know, if as El Nino becomes more common because it's getting warmer and wetter, what is going to happen to the vegetation in the future. And generally what we think is that based on this work that we've done recently, that it's going to get wetter, which means it's going to get greener. And that greenness of split out the wet season and dry season, it's going to be the wet season is going to get a lot greener. And in particular, if you split out the wet areas, the wet zones from the dry zones, the wet and humid like mountaintop areas are going to stay kind of the same. They're kind of as green as they can get, but those dry arid regions are going to get a lot greener. So you're going to have a significant greening up in the drier, especially the wet season during those dry areas. So what does this mean? Well, for one thing, here I've graphed out these there's a bunch of invasive species, invasive plants in the Galapagos, and here are three of them: cedar, blackberry, and guava. And you can see that this is showing where they occur in this zone of like going from dry to green, basically, like how productive it is. And the lower limits of them is determined by how productive the landscape is. And as we have a greening up, you might see both the native, but also the invasive vegetation sort of creeping down into the lowlands, into the drier areas. Tortoises, they migrate seasonally, some of them following the green up of the dry areas. And if there's more green up or more frequent green up, some of them may change their migration routes or may migrate less or more depending on the populations. You also have some tortoises that are adapted. The dome-shaped large tortoises are adapted to the wet green sort of areas, whereas there's saddleback sort of smaller tortoises that are not, they're more adapted to arid areas. So you might expect climate change to favor the bigger domed more tortoises. Now, it's not entirely good news for tortoises. I mean, they're going to mostly probably like the vegetation, at least the adults, because they'll be eating it. But tortoises lay their eggs in nests, and it turns out that when those nests get wet, the eggs all rot and die. And so if we're having frequent rain events, then you may expect that there's going to be really poor hatching rates of these eggs. And so modeled out here, this blue line is showing the number of years, the frequency of years where just no eggs are going to hatch from the tortoises in the future. And you get up to like potentially 80–90% of the years where the tortoise eggs just can't hatch because it's too wet, which sounds bad, but it may not be that bad, because tortoises actually, their whole life strategy is like live long, have lots of eggs that don't work, and every once in a while an egg will hatch and move on. So that's, there's other things you might think about with, the marine iguanas too. If there's more warm and wet years, it's bad for the marine iguanas in general. They're going to have less algae. So in general, dynamic effects, a lot of different things, directions this could go, and a lot of it's just going to be a system that's always been in flux and is going to be even more in flux, and things are going to shift. So I'm out of time, so I'll just pass it off to Andrew.
All right, thank you very much, Noah. Andrew, you are next.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you, Allison, Noah. Fantastic presentations, and it bums me out that I have to go third after that, but whatever, I will do my best. What I want to talk about is fairly short and sweet, and it relates to the fact that we are dealing with a set of islands that is, by any stretch of the imagination, iconic. It's a word which is applied perhaps too liberally to the Galapagos. And specifically, I want to take on two aspects of its iconicism, of its facility for being iconic. One is in the history of science. We have this vision of this is where the theory of natural selection was born. This is where Darwin got it, so to speak. The second is in a very basic premise of evolutionary biology, which is how biodiversity is generated, and that is via the process of speciation, which is essentially the splitting of evolutionary lineages. So you got one parental population, which somehow produces two daughter populations, which eventually become so different from each other, we've got two new species. That's a pretty key component of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And again, the Galapagos are deservedly iconic in having played a very central role in the working out of that theory, or this, what I'm going to call the standard theory. So we have two sort of mini icons. We have history of science icon, and we have an evolutionary biology icon. Let's start with the history of science icon. Let me pull up this. Oops, that's the wrong screen. Sorry, I will. There we go. Good. Sorry, no, I am in the wrong screen. Never mind. Sorry about this. Okay, good. So here we are. This is a scenario. You might have even recognized some of the, again, iconic iconography here. which is Darwin's famous, this is the dawn of tree thinking in his notebook shortly after he came back from the voyage of the Beagle. Then we have the 4 heads of the closely related finch species. Again, this is from Darwin's book on the voyage of the Beagle. And we have this image, and it's sort of seared into the imagination. We like our history of science simple. And here's the story. Darwin, probing intellect, all these interesting experiences in South America. Lo and behold, he gets to the Galapagos, and it's all about the Galapagos. We have him sort of in the prow of the ship as the Beagle forges forward, the wind whipping through his sideburns. He leaps into the shallows, and there are all those finches with their strangely shaped different little bills and so on. Some have big bills, some have little bills. And now we go into slow-mo, and the young Darwin has his eureka moment. He leaps off the boat into the shallows, and the rest, as we say, is history. We have this, obviously, it's not quite like that. We have this sort of rather romanticized view of how great ideas are born, eureka moments. Nothing, frankly, could be further from the truth. Darwin was training, remember, at this stage, or at least before he went on the voyage of the Beagle, become a Church of England vicar. And he was what we call a natural theologian, which basically means he's looking at nature, and he's marveling at nature in the same way as a modern scientist does, actually. But instead of looking at mechanism or whatever, what he's actually interested in is glory in God. So the design of the finches, those different bills, was all about divine design, okay? So he looks at that, and he looks at the Galapagos, and he says, I think this is a perfectly reasonable premise. He says, look, there's a bunch of piles of volcanic ash sort of scattered across the equator. Why would God, our designer, design different finches for different environments? Because they're the same environments in this case. So what Darwin did, this is the ultimate scientific error, and it's the most basic scientific error that you cannot make, is he failed to label where his finches came from, which island, because all the islands were the same, and God would put the same finches on each island. So why would I bother to write for about 8 seconds the name of the island from which this finch came? So he gets back to Britain. He's completely confused by the finches. He doesn't, and there's a great statement. He says, he writes in his notebook, there reigns in me a great confusion concerning these finches. He doesn't think they're all finches. He thinks some are finches, some are warblers, some are grosbeaks, and so on. In other words, he's completely missed the boat on what these finches are, and how they are in fact derived from a single common ancestor, and they diversified to produce lots of different species, each with a bill that ideally is adapted for a particular purpose. So what should he have been looking for? Well, this is a little simplified. Let's look at the process. And again, this is the dumbed down, cliched version of the process of evolution on islands. Here's the Galapagos. Let's simplify things by turning the archipelago into a set of green bars in a blue background. Now, let's do our actual experiment. What we're going to do is, we've got our islands, they're separated. We're just going to plonk down genetically identical populations, and I'm going to color code your genetic identity. So we're going to start with genetically identical. So maybe these are rodents, maybe they're little birds that can't fly very far. They're isolated on their islands. The key thing is they're all basically the same genetically to start with. So each island has its orange population of things. All right. Now, this is where it gets, so fine, boring. This is where it gets interesting. We're going to add a time dimension. So we're going to run this for 1 million years. And what's going to happen? Well, things are going to change. Remember, color represents sort of genetic affinities. Over time, different mutations are going to arise on different islands. And different islands are therefore going to evolve. The populations are going to evolve into different directions, such that at the end of the process, and this is why islands are, quote, natural laboratories. This is why they are so central to our understanding of evolutionary biology. Each island, if you like, is a separate evolutionary experiment. It is its own distinct evolutionary trajectory. Each island is, yes, a genuine microcosm in this regard, and each one is distinct. Okay, did you get that, Darwin? Darwin was told that the tortoises from each island were distinct. You could tell them from the pattern of the shell which island a tortoise came from. He ignored that. The finches, he completely blew the finches. As I said, he was confused about whether they even belonged to the same group of birds. It was, and this is, I think, beautifully telling. This says so much about the scientific process. It was not a eureka moment. It was when young Darwin, back from the 5-year voyage of the Beagle, sends his specimens to the august John Gould, the sort of go-to ornithologist in London at the time. John Gould, who's not an evolutionist, he's not interested in species changing, but he knows his birds. He looks at Darwin's finches and says, these aren't warblers and grosbeaks, these are all finches. And today, we'd say they're all closely related. They have strong affinities in the language of John Gould. If you want a eureka moment in the Darwin story, it's not stumbling through the shallows, the surf at the Galápagos. It's the younger man basically being put straight by the older man in his office 6 months after he came back from the voyage of the Beagle, telling him this, and this is where Darwin is essentially put right, and this is where the penny drops. And from that is born what we'll call the classical model of diversification. So that's the history of science. History of science is more complicated. It's not a eureka moment. It's about collaboration. It's about bringing different things to the table. Now let's quickly move to speciation. I love this graph. This graph comes from Peter and Rosemary Grant, who probably well known as the inheritors of Darwin's work on the finches. They have done decades of beautiful work on the finches and the islands, and we know a huge amount about evolution in general, courtesy the work of Peter and Rosemary Grant. This is a really cool graph. As you can see, the finches probably arrived about 3 million years ago, and the islands themselves were about 4.5 million years old. So the red line is geophysics. So it's the hotspot accumulation of islands as the plates travel across the hotspot. Notice it was rather slow to start with, and we've had this very rapid, relatively recent accumulation of islands, and with it, species of finches. Species of finches have tracked the availability of islands. Why? Because you need that separation so that each population can go its own way, or so the standard theory dictates. Not always, it turns out. I think this is amazing, super cool. This is a recent paper with, as you can see, Peter and Rosemary Grant on it. Now, Peter and Rosemary Grant worked on this tiny island called Daphne Major, which you can see on the map there. It's a tiny island, and they spent months every year there, and they recorded everything. They banded and recorded, measured every bird on the island. They counted the caterpillars, as you saw from Noah's slide. That was their data, counting caterpillars on the vegetation. They measured the seed set of the different plants. They measured everything, and they knew literally every bird on that island, which is why I think this is so cool. They knew when, and this is probably about 10 years ago, a stranger appeared in the midst of the familiar birds on the island. And this stranger turned out to be an individual and an immigrant species. It's a specimen of Geospiza conorostris, which is not present on Daphne Major, and it's come a long way from Espanola. It's that red dotted line. It's a serious hike to end up in the wrong place, where it meets no members of its own species. But because these things have evolved so recently, and are sort of partly isolated by being on different islands, it turns out that this thing could still interbreed with Geospiza, a female Geospiza fortis on the island. Okay, so weird interspecific sex, normally a disaster. I mean, you probably don't produce anything, and if you do, it's maladapted or anything or whatever. In this case, bizarrely, produced offspring which were very distinctive. They were known as by the Grants as big bird, and big birds mated with each other. So this is heavy inbreeding, but what we're getting is a new species. Courtesy this rogue immigrant, courtesy this slightly dodgy hybridization, interspecific hybridization event. And what you can see in this plot over here on the right is that the new species has its own distinct bill morphology, which probably allows it to coexist with the other species because it's not competing for the same seeds and insects and other resources on the island. In other words, again, we have an iconic story about how new species come into being, but when push comes to shove, and when people like Peter Grant and Rosemary Grant put the work in, that kind of unravels. And so the Galapagos are iconic, these stories are iconic, but they're also too simplified. They're too cliched, and both intellectual scientific developments and science itself, nature itself, refuses to be shoved into a little cliche box. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Those were all really terrific presentations. I'm going to act as moderator and just get kind of the conversation going. And I think I'll start with you, Andrew, since we just ended.
Since my vocal cords are still warm.
Yes, and you're thinking and doing all that good stuff. So the question, it's kind of from the description is how does the Galapagos continue to entice us as it had for a century and a half? And I'd like to just change that to you. How does it seems like it does continue to entice you. And maybe you could just talk about that.
It absolutely entices me, but I think I'm going to generalize. Look, it entices me as an evolutionary biologist. As I said, islands are special because they are isolated. The populations on an island are populated from the population on the next door island. Whereas on the mainland, even if you've got, it's a bit of distance, you can still exchange genes between population A and population B. What does that mean? It means population A and B never really become very distinct, very different. Whereas if they're on separate islands, mutations here, those mutations, those differences are going to stay in population A and the same for population B, which means that all sorts of interesting things from an evolutionary point of view happen on islands. But the coolest part is this idea that islands, especially oceanic islands like the Galapagos, are essentially ecologically incomplete. They lack certain things which haven't sort of arrived. So it's a sort of weirdly messy, haphazard, sort of put together ecosystem just because of the serendipitous nature of colonization. So this is why the allure is absolutely undying. All sorts of wonderfully weird things have evolved in response of the absences, the gaps in the ecosystems and the opportunities that are there. And look, Noah already talked about it. Think about this. There's a bunch of really ugly lizards, which instead of being lizards have taken to snorkeling, basically, to swimming underwater to graze on seaweed, lizards. So look, that's islands for you, and the Galapagos do islands better than anywhere else. So yes, the allure is impossible to resist. Just amazing.
So maybe Noah, you want to step in?
No, yeah, I mean, just from an ecological perspective, the fact that you can have little islands and see populations in a discrete sense and track them is definitely part of the lure. Part of the lure is just the distinctiveness of the fauna there, and the fact that they have been there are things that hadn't been touched until just a few hundred years ago So we still have Galapagos tortoises, and they went their own way, and so they're a pretty unique system, and so it's just really cool there. But yeah, yeah, no, yeah, yeah. So it's a lot. I will say it's a pretty hard place to actually work on the ground, and there hasn't been as much research perhaps on the ground as maybe you think there would be and think there should be, but it's pretty well protected and pretty tricky to get in there. There are some like the Grants and others who have had some really amazing work done there. So
yeah, Deborah, I challenge anyone to go to the Galapagos and not be blown away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, it's thought-provoking, it's everything.
Yes, and Allison, do you want to jump in, talk about, we saw the work that you produced from a trip there, but maybe just your own reaction to being there.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why it entices us is for me, it shows the possibilities. These animals have lived for many years being protected there, so they're not afraid of humans in the same way that other animals are. And there's just this sort of like amazing feeling of there could be different ways of being in the world. So I think that's part of it. And then also for me as an artist, there's less maybe visual noise. Like there's a stronger energy there to nature because of the fact that there is less there. And that's just kind of, for me, a fact.
Yeah, and actually, just to kind of extend that idea, I was very struck by in your statement, that you're interested in climate change and extinction, but also about the intimacy of connection and how we need that intimacy for our collective survival. So I think that's just a really interesting idea that maybe the scientists also would respond to that.
I think it's a really interesting idea, but I want Allison to explain it first before I comment on it.
Okay.
Well, I use intimacy as a strategy in my work, a way to make people, I believe that fundamentally, if folks could feel connected to things outside themselves, to other things in the natural world, to everything in existence, then there is where change could be possible. That's the avenue that I approach it from anyways. And so for me, thinking of ways that are intimate, like I have the thinking about the earth as a brain experiencing climate change as trauma, or I have another piece where I interview different female identified and non-binary artists about traumas they had as children, fantasies they had as children that helped them deal with trauma, and all of those feature nature in this really incredible way. And so I just kind of go at it from this spiritual angle when I make my works, trying to kind of create just a moment when people can kind of let their guard down and be open. And I use beauty as well, like I mentioned before, as kind of a way to make topics that could be difficult, like climate change and extinction, more accessible, to bring people into the conversation.
So sometimes I wonder too if that intimacy and that connection is an end in itself. The more as a scientist I study nature and long-term change and stuff, the less it sometimes makes sense for us to be trying to protect nature for its sake as much as just like our own sense of balance and happiness, and that's sort of it. Because just when you take the long view and you're always seeing 10,000 years how much change and upheaval always happens, like, yeah.
Yeah, but I can see, so I like the idea, and again, the sort of noise-free thing. We're bombarded in a way with documentaries and so on. There's plenty of nature out there, but I challenge anyone to go and spend some, it doesn't have to, it can be a standard tourist, 1 week sort of in and out, visit 3 or 4 of the islands. And because you are so up close and personal, yes, intimate, And again, partly because of the history of the islands and the fact that everything, they're not learned to be afraid of people, a lot of the animals in particular, is transformative. It changes your relationship to the natural world. The natural world is normally something which might be a bit scary or a problem because you've got rats in your basement. But when you go out there, or it might be something you watch on a TV screen, or maybe you see in a zoo, but then you go there and there's actual nature and you're close and up close and personal with it. It's unbeatable.
I don't know. I would hope that, and I think that we could find that intimacy without having to go to the Galapagos. And I think that what we lack maybe is just the understanding of how to go into our backyard and actually find, in New England, we're about to have the salamanders migrating, and like how many people are going to go out and hold them in their hands and connect with them. And I feel like you can find that experience as powerful as putting down a bunch of money and going somewhere that is only for the exclusive. I think that more of that is, maybe more powerful.
Oh, well, look, I think that's a consciousness we need to create, that nature is not something that just happens in a few special places. But I think you're hard pushed to just from a sort of PR perspective to have a handful of salamanders, which, don't get me wrong, I'm very partial to, versus the sort of Panavision splendor of the Galapagos.
They're pretty cute.
Yeah. Salamanders are cute.
So I'm just looking at the clock, a couple more minutes together, and then Eduardo will invite our audience to join us. And what I keep hearing is something that often comes up in our Catalyst conversations, which is the criticality of hope and optimism. And it seems that your collective interest in the Galapagos is it makes you hopeful, or you're hopeful in relationship to the Galapagos. That somehow we're going to survive. And looking at the Galapagos is a kind of a meter in a way. So anyone wants to respond to that? I feel hopeful when I listen to people like you talking.
I think islands serve as, for want of a better term, alternative universes in which we can, and especially a fairly pristine environment like the Galapagos, or reasonably pristine environment, where yes, we can see things which are unsullied. I mean, this might be naive, but Shakespeare parks the Tempest on an island, and that's this sort of partial experiment. That obviously the bad components of the island, there's Caliban and so on, but you've also got the sort of mystical hope of a better future under Prospero's cells and so on. Again, it's an alternative. This isn't Europe. This is an island somewhere, right, in which different rules apply. It's a different universe out there. So I think that's part of it about islands. It's the fact they're distinct, they're different, and they're, yes, isolated.
I think for me, I mean, I look at the Galapagos and I think, like, as Andrew said, the story of how there's evolutionary change happening really fast. They're happening all around us, that, and the long time frame of change and species doing their thing in all sorts of ways. The fact is, life is going to persist no matter what, and we're going to see change, and there's hope in the fact that life is going to, it's going to change, but it's going to be around, and we don't have to necessarily feel too sad about the change, even though it's hard and we all feel nostalgic for the past. Like, change that's what the world is built for. So that's open.
And Noah, you think, I mean, so famously the sort of pushback on an evolutionary response to climate change is that we're changing things too fast that, you know, we're outstripping the ability of natural populations to evolve in response of what we're doing to them. Do you think, would you say that's not demonstrably not true, that organisms can evolve
sure,
sufficiently
that's true.
rapidly?
No, that is absolutely true as well. Both. I mean, it's going to be the biggest extinction event, one of the biggest we've ever experienced. But after the comet hit the Earth and like everything was vaporized like instantaneously anywhere near North America, like 99% of the species died, life came back, and here we are. So, you know,
That is taking the long view now.
That's why we need Noah just for that. So I think, Eduardo, this is a good moment to bring our audience on, and I see some questions in the chat that you will read to our speakers. So that'll just take a moment.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and begin to bring everyone up on the stage with us. I do recommend, please, everyone to continue to have your mics muted so that we avoid any background noise. And if you would like to ask your question directly to the speakers, go ahead and just raise your hand. That way, again, we avoid any feedback noise. If you do type your question in the chat button, then I will go ahead and read that as well. Okay, so everyone should be joining us. And again, you know, if you feel free to continue to have your camera off if you do not want to turn it on.
While we're waiting, can I ask a very quick question? Noah, what are your kids' names?
Juno here and Alder down there.
Hi, guys.
Yeah, they met the Grants one time when they were.
Oh, cool.
So are we ready to go here?
Yes. So we currently don't have any questions written up. So again, feel free to raise your hand, and you'll see the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom window. So you can ask your question directly to our speakers.
There is a chat question. Don't we have to make people realize the Earth is an island? Is that?
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to
Okay.
answer?
Yeah, so let me go ahead and just repeat that question. So we have a question from George. His question is, don't we have to make people realize the Earth is an island?
I can go first on that. And George, yes, absolutely. And there's the famous, the pale blue dot image from the Apollo missions, which I think says that beautifully. And it's that underpins an island is this discrete entity which is entirely self-sustained, right? That's the thing about an island. If I'm a predator living on an island, I'm eating the prey that's on the island. I can't get my prey from anywhere else. So that's the key thing about the island. It has to be a self-sustaining entity. So yes, I absolutely agree. If we can get that mindset out there that yes, this is a tiny, tiny island in the vastness of the cosmos. And boy, have we got to look after it, because whatever various futurists tell us, I, for one, don't fancy moving to Mars.
I mean, I think that that's part of what I'm trying to address in my work. The idea that we're surrounded by the fantastic every day, and that like magical realism just helps us see the magical in the real, which is like how I'm thinking about Galápagos. Like I said, we're surrounded by the fantastic every day, but thinking about a place like Galápagos helps us maybe reach that a little bit closer, which if thinking about it as the same as the Earth, I think works as well.
I'm going to jump in. Just a question from Elizabeth Awalt. How effective can an artist be in making change in the natural world? So maybe Allison, you already answered that, but Any other thoughts?
I think not alone, not by themselves. I think that this is really where collaboration and interdisciplinary work comes in. I think it's the work of artists, it's the work of scientists, it's the work of politicians, it's the work of economists. It's all of us working together. I think that's the main thing. In my work, I do try to change the individuals that are engaging with the work and hope to open up something where the possibility of being open to this dialogue is an option for people, if that makes sense. But I do think that the actual hard work is going to be an interdisciplinary collaborative process.
So I would, and I'm worried, I get nervous when this conversation goes into this direction, but I would add to that. I see, yes, I completely agree. Yeah, it's got to be everyone. It's got to be collaborative. But what artists do better than the rest of us is essentially, and I think it's essentially what you do, Allison, which is provokes. So, you know, Noah and people like me can go on banging away about, you know, his CO2 levels ramping up, and there's a sort of central inhibition going on, I think, for a lot of people. Oh yeah, we know that. Thank you. Move on next, please. But then they walk into the Children's Museum, whatever, and bang, they're forced to reconsider, partly because it's coming, well, I was going to say coming out of left field, it's coming out of left field, center field, and right field in your case. So I do think that's a key thing, is to jar people out of their complacency.
Yeah, I think communication is what the artist has, just a different way, a different language, a different way of communicating, and different artists approach it from different angles as ways of provoking.
And
Yeah. Well, I should say, you know, within conservation biology, you know, there has been a shift, an explicit shift over the last few decades to move from the scientists in a bubble trying to like do their experiments and then tell the world how to do it, to the like, let's start with everybody before we even ask our questions and let them ask us the questions, and do integrated sort of the society science feedback loop, and all players, we're just a part, but it's been a very explicit shift in thinking.
Okay, we have a question from Ellen. Ellen, if you could please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. This was a wonderful presentation by everyone. And I have a friend who's a doctor who went to the Galápagos some years ago and described it to me as a life-changing event. And so I started Googling, you know, how to go to the Galápagos. And I'm wondering, from the three of you, when a person just goes as a tourist, what that experience, can you say anything about what that experience is like? Obviously not going as a researcher, I might go with sound recording equipment, but how are tourists, how do we move around the islands while respecting all the life that is there?
Well, I guess I'll say for myself, I've actually only set foot on the Galápagos as a tourist. And you know, the research I do has been remote and satellites and stuff, and worked with a whole team of researchers who were down there, but I wasn't actually down there. So, you know, I went on a boat, like I happened to be leading a tour, helping. I got on this thing, but it was a tourist thing, so I didn't have to pay for it. But which is the big barrier, right? And you know, you have, it's very controlled into where you can go and where you can sleep, and who can go in, and how long, and all this kind of stuff. But you can get out, and the naturalists will take you through the hikes, and the animals, as was mentioned, are they're not afraid of people, so they just sit there and let you walk up to them, and you get a real sense of all, I mean, I think good parts of it, and it's well controlled. I mean, that's what, you know, economically it's really built for, and thrives off of the ecotourism there. So I think they do a pretty good job of making that work. So yeah.
we have time for one more question, and I see a raised hand of Kimberly.
I was actually just going to tell Ellen that we went this summer, and it is life-changing. We went on a boat of 16 people. The naturalists are amazing. so in love with what they do that, their goal is to make you fall in love and therefore take care of their, the islands. But it is, I would say for everybody going to Noah's Point, it's very well controlled. So, you have to respect what's going on there because there's no other way to do it. And it is far and away in my 65 years, the most amazing thing I've ever done. And I would save up your pennies, which is what I did to do it.
Thank you.
That's a pretty good write-up. Thank you.
So I'm just being aware of the time. Well, it's a little after 7. I don't want it to end. We could keep doing this for at least another hour, but we're going to end soon. And I just want to end the conversation with a quote from poet Jane Hirschfield. And you can insert artist for poet here. And she writes, "Poetry and science each seek to ground our lives in both what exists and the sense of the large, of mystery and awe. Every scientist I know is grounded in curiosity, wonder, the spirit of exploration, and the spirit of service, as is every poet." So I just think that very nicely describes the three of you. And it's just, I think, a good place to end. I want to thank the speakers again for just wonderful presentations and discussion, and to you, our audience, as well. And to let you know, our next program is March 2nd with Teddy Asher. There they are, Teddy Asher and Lucy Kim, talking about perception, vision, and consciousness. And it's in collaboration with BU and Peabody Essex Museum. So join us for that. That's going to be live. It'll be our first live program in 2 years. So we're very much looking forward to that. So I think we'll leave it there. And again, thank you, everybody, for coming. And oh yeah, you can visit our website to see archive and podcasts and catalystconversations.org, all kinds of interesting materials on the website. So again, thank you and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.